Alright, hello. So today I'm going to be trying to show you how to code with Vex Coding in 5 minutes. So first we need a robot. So this is like the little design I made just to show. So we're going to say that it has 4 wheels and it's going to be 1 motor per wheel. So for right now we're just coding these 4 motors. So in the code here, basically what you want to do is you want to tell the motors when to move. So basically we're going to say that these are our 4 motors, and we might end up using these, and we have to use the controller. So the controller is basically like one of the things you call it back to tell when a motor to move. So, for example, when you want the front left wheel to spin, it's going to go on the controller, and it's going to say axis 3 on one of the joysticks. And it's listed on the controller what axis is what joystick. So basically, each part of the driver, just the drivetrain, lists the motor, tells it what to do right here, and then tells it what direction and on what how it's going to move. So when it moves on axis 3, it's moving on the joystick. Now if we were to have, say, like an intake right here, we would tell it that when this controller, which is the main controller, what button it is, which is R1, is being pressed or is pressing, it's going to tell it what needs to spin or what doesn't need to spin. And then if you want it to do multiple things in that one grouping, you can do else if to tell it another thing, and else basically just means it's always going to do just that, unless it's being pushed with these two. So if neither of these are being pushed on the controller, this is being used. And this is telling the motor and telling it what brake it's going to use. So say you don't want the drivetrain to be driving all the time, and if it's released you don't want it to fully stop, so it's telling it to that there's no force on the motor at all, so it's just going to go. Now when you want to go do autonomous, basically it's completely different because it's not using a controller. So basically if you want a motor to go, you have to tell it to start moving and then for how far. So what I use is I use a float, which basically is a grouping. So basically if I put this here, it tells it for all 4 of these. So all these motors are going to move the same distance without me having to list all the individuals. And then you put a sleep here just to make sure that everything is read right. Another thing you can do is use sensors like we have. So this turns the optical sensor basically senses colors like in the real world. So if you wanted to find a color while on the robot, it would use it. So basically this turns the LED for on, and this sets the brightness. And then when you're coding, if you want this to go forward, but after it goes forward you want to make sure it does something or sees a color, you want to say wait. So basically the code is going to wait until this sensor sees the color that it's looking for, and then it'll continue. Another thing is the spin. So basically if you want a motor to spin, you don't want it to be going for a certain amount, you just want it to spin until you tell it to stop. So an example of that is if you wanted to spin, say, something that would grab something at the start, you just set it to spin instead of spin for a certain amount, so it just spins until it grabs it and doesn't accidentally stop. And then at the start of all this you want to set how fast your motors go. So this is a int command, which basically is kind of like a float with the grouping. So all of this, all these that say drive, will call back to this. So all these are the exact same speed as this, which is 80 RPM. Now this one, since I would change these a lot, I just used numbers for RPM, so they can all be just listed. And then this, so first example, in your code, right, if you hit a wall and it stops, it could just stop there for the rest of the code and not do anything. This basically tells it if the motor hasn't completed its thing in 5 seconds, it's going to move on to the next thing to prevent the code from being jammed. And I think that's it. So that's kind of what I